Thank you, John. As John indicated, my theme today is vindication, but I don't mean that in a vindictive sense. I mean simply that the truth has prevailed, which means that when we come here for a conference like this, we don't do so in vain. We're not speaking to each other in an echo chamber. We are heard by the outside world. We are heard in the Vatican itself. In fact, we are heard by the Pope himself, as will be clear from this presentation. Last year, when we conducted a conference on these themes, there was a breakthrough. So much so that I wrote an additional chapter to my book, The Secret Still Hidden, and the title of that chapter is Vindication. Again, not in a vindictive sense. And the reason we had a breakthrough last year is because of a very unexpected development, and that was the attendance at the conference last year by none other than Giuseppe De Carli. He's a co-author and collaborator with Cardinal Bertone in two books, which is actually the same book, published twice. The first is The Last Visionary of Fatima, and the new edition of that book is The Last Secret of Fatima. And those two books promote what I discussed yesterday, the so-called party line on Fatima. And when Mr. De Carli appeared last year, there was a rupture in the wall of silence. He came through that wall to have a direct encounter with us. And as a result of that encounter, the truth began to come out in a very dramatic way, a way that even the mass media in Italy were forced to take cognizance of. And there resulted from that encounter a massive departure from the party line in the form of a series of revelations from Mr. De Carli, and I'll discuss some of them today. Now, just by way of preliminaries, one of the things Mr. De Carli revealed last year is that according to Cardinal Bertone, the Vatican Secretary of State, he engaged in approximately 15 to 16 hours of conversations with the late visionary of Fatima, Sister Lucia. And one of the things Mr. De Carli wanted to know is what they could possibly have spoken of for those 15 to 16 hours. And he said at the conference last year that he would like to know what they said to each other. I'm quoting him directly. And the Cardinal stopped me, stood up and said, "I know, but I can't tell you because I've recorded them." Now that led Mr. De Carli to think, well, this is surprising. Maybe there are tape recordings of these 15 to 16 hours of conversation. He thought Cardinal Bertone meant tape recordings. Finally, we could find out for ourselves in some objective way whatever it was Sister Lucia is supposed to have said to the Cardinal. But then he replied to Bertone as follows. "No," he said, "more than recorded, I kept lengthy notes. I kept a diary of those meetings. All the responses that Sister Lucia gave me, I wrote them down," end quote. So according to Cardinal Bertone, his personal notes are better than a tape recording. And where are these notes? Like the text that pertains to the vision published in 2000, those notes, I maintain, are well hidden in the Vatican, if in fact they exist. But we've never seen those notes, and neither has Mr. De Carli. Another issue that came to the fore during his direct remarks to the audience was the existence of a secret letter from Lucia to the Pope, which she delivered to him in the year 2000 during his visit to Fatima, when Cardinal Bertone, or rather Cardinal Sodano, revealed that the third secret was about to be published. Now, we traditionalists, as they call us, we Fatimites, have long spoken about this letter delivered by Lucia to the Pope in the year 2000. And we were ridiculed for this as one more example of our silly conspiracy theories. But here is Mr. DeCarli confirming before the cameras at our conference last year that, in fact, there was a letter given by Lucia to the Pope at Fatima. And he was asked point blank, or he asked Bertone point blank, what was in this letter? And I'm quoting from page 239 of my account of last year's conference in the second edition of the book. And we read the following. I asked the cardinal if he knew what was in that letter, and he responded, no, I don't know, because this is private documentation of the Holy Father, John Paul II. The current owner is the Archbishop of Krakow, Stanislaw Dziewicz. So now we have confirmation of a secret letter from Lucia to the Pope, given by her to the Pope at the time he let it be known through the Secretary of State that the third secret was going to be revealed, and we don't know what's in that letter. It's now in the custody of the Archbishop of Krakow. Those are just a couple of preliminaries that were very interesting. But then we got to the heart of the matter. Something very unexpected happened last year. Mr. DeCarli remained at the podium for a question and answer session after his direct remarks. And we who were in attendance, John Salza, who is an attorney, myself and Father Gruner, knew that this was a unique opportunity, probably the only opportunity we would ever have to engage in the direct questioning of someone who is a primary defender of the party line. Now, John and I are lawyers, so we have this instinct when it comes time to question a witness, and we have a limited opportunity. You question the witness on the weakest link in his story. There are many weak links in the official account. But what is the weakest link, we thought to ourselves, if we get the chance to question Mr. DeCarli, that we could probe and trying to get him to admit that there's a huge problem with the official account. And the weakest link is the existence, now confirmed as an historical fact, of the so-called Capovilla envelope. We know as a fact that Archbishop Capovilla, the personal secretary of John the 23rd, prepared an envelope. Inside that envelope is a text of the third secret of Fatima. And on the outside of that envelope are the names of everyone who read the contents, high-ranking prelates in the Vatican, and the dictation of John the 23rd to the effect that he would not give a judgment on the contents of that envelope. He would leave it to his successors to render a judgment. So that envelope with its contents was resealed. And we know that in 1963, 2 years before the official account says Paul VI read a text of the secret, in 1965. Rather, in 1963, Paul VI had the substitute Secretary of State ask Archbishop Capovilla, where was the Capovilla envelope? And Archbishop Capovilla said, it's in the writing desk in John the 23rd's bedroom, the writing desk called Barbarigo. And they retrieved that envelope, the Capovilla envelope, with its telltale notations on the outside, opened it up, and Paul VI read the contents of that envelope in 1963, within days of becoming Pope, 2 years before the official account, the so-called official account, the party line, says that Paul VI read the secret, namely in 1965. That's a huge discrepancy. Now, in being questioned about the Capovilla envelope, at first Mr. DeCarli said at this conference last year that he had taken a photograph of it. And I'm quoting him directly, by my own photographer, because I did not trust them completely, end quote. So here is a defender of the party line coming before us last year to say that he had taken a picture of the Capovilla envelope using his own photographer because he did not trust the people who were showing him what he was photographing, namely the people in the Vatican. Only as the question and answer session progressed, it was clear that Mr. De Carli had never actually photographed the Capovilla envelope. He was confusing it with the envelopes that were shown on the Porta a Porta telecast of May 31st in the year 2000 and 2007, and that he claimed repeatedly that this was the Capovilla envelope, but it wasn't. On May 31st, 2007, Capovilla, Archbishop Cardinal Bertone, the Secretary of State, displayed an assemblage of 4 envelopes, not one of which was the Capovilla envelope. And then finally in the Q&A session, he admitted that, well, okay, I didn't actually photograph the Capovilla envelope. And he was finally reduced to arguing, as I show in the latest edition of my book, that, well, okay, the Capovilla envelope was shown on camera, except that the notations I just mentioned were on the back. And during the telecast of May 31st, 2007, Cardinal Bertone never turned the envelopes around to show us the back. And if he had done that, we would have seen that he showed us the Capovilla envelope on camera. Now that was an improvisation. I don't say that he was deliberately misleading us when he said this, but clearly it's false. As we show in the book, it's probably too small to make out here, but pages 336 and 337, you see the backs of the envelopes that were displayed on camera, and there's no writing on the back of those envelopes. And on the front is the writing that we've already seen, which has nothing to do with the notations on the outside of the Capovilla envelope. Therefore, Mr. De Carli was evidently never shown the Capovilla envelope. We know the Capovilla envelope exists because Archbishop Capovilla confirms its existence, the Vatican admits its existence, and yet we have never seen it. And the failure to produce that envelope and its contents is powerful evidence of the existence of a second text of the Third Secret of Fatima. And as Mr. De Carli said in conclusion, retreating from his original position, and I'm quoting, "Then again, they could have tricked me, showing me something different. But my clear impression is that the envelope is the same. The Capovilla envelope is equal to the Bertone envelope." So his certainty then becomes a clear impression. But clearly, the clear impression is not well-founded. That envelope was never shown to us on May 31st, 2007. The world has never seen it, and yet we know it exists. And at one point, Mr. De Carli claimed that he photographed the Capovilla envelope, only to retreat from that position, but he also said that he included it in the latest edition of the last Visionary of Fatima, which is now called The Last Secret of Fatima, but nowhere in The Last Secret of Fatima is there a photograph of that envelope. It just isn't there. So something is seriously amiss with the official account, and we learned this from Mr. De Carli himself. And he admits they could have tricked me. Another issue that came up was the testimony of Archbishop Capovilla to Solideo Paolini. You know from having followed this controversy that during a conversation with Archbishop Capovilla, following their face-to-face encounter, Solideo Paolini said to Archbishop Capovilla, "We have a problem here. According to your contemporaneous documentation, the Capovilla envelope was opened and its contents were read by Paul VI in 1963. But the Vatican's official account says Paul VI did not read the Third Secret for the first time until 1965. How do you explain this enormous discrepancy? Is it, in fact, the case that there are 2 different envelopes and 2 different texts, both of which relate to the Third Secret in its entirety?" And as Archbishop Capovilla famously replied to Mr. Solideo Paolini, "Per l'appunto." Exactly so. And that testimony was absolutely explosive. And Archbishop Capovilla has never, in any forum, explicitly confronted that testimony and denied that he gave it. In fact, when Archbishop Bertone, or Cardinal Bertone, produced him as a witness in September 2007 in another telecast by way of a video interview that was heavily edited, Archbishop Capovilla was never even asked about his testimony to Soli Deo Paolini. But last year at the conference, during the question and answer session, when he was repeatedly pressed on this issue, Mr. De Carli made the following claim, and I'm quoting. Look, I have in hand, meaning available to him. He didn't actually have it in the room. I have in hand a letter by Monsignor Capovilla sent to the Secretary of State and to the Holy Father in which he denies he ever responded in such a way to Soli Deo Paolini. He denies it. So either this Soli Deo Paolini is a liar and has profited from it, or Monsignor Capovilla is a liar. I believe Soli Deo Paolini is a liar. That's what Mr. De Carli said last year. And I asked him immediately, this is my question, it's recorded on the videotape. May I have a copy of this letter? Mr. Salza joined in. Why have you not published this letter from Capovilla, if it could answer all the questions? And Mr. De Carli's answer, because it's private correspondence, I can't. I'm sorry. Now, this is very interesting. It's private correspondence. He cannot show it to us, and yet he can talk about it. And he can tell us what's in it, supposedly, allegedly. But he has failed to produce it. Now, in a sense, we're dealing with a kind of investigation. I hate to reduce it to those terms, but that's what it is. We're dealing with a puzzle here. We're dealing with what is clearly a cover-up. And so you want to apply to that set of facts the same principles that you would apply to any investigation. And one principle is what lawyers call a negative inference. If there's a document that you claim exists, which is your Exhibit A, and for some reason you fail to produce it, you would just like to talk about it but not show it to anybody, that failure to produce the document gives rise to a negative inference. And the inference is, you would have produced that document, you would have shown it to us if it were helpful to you. And therefore, if it exists, it must be most unhelpful to your position. There was no credible reason why, if this letter existed, it would not have been shown to us, and in fact, published to the world. It's never been published. It's never been shown. The only one who ever mentioned its existence was Mr. De Carli in passing during our conference last year. Another issue that came up was this key problem of the linkage of the Third Secret of Fatima to the year 1960. Now, that linkage is devastating to the official account. Because if the secret is linked to 1960, there goes the official interpretation, which tries to limit the Third Secret of Fatima to historical events in the 20th century, culminating in 1981 with the attempt on the life of John Paul II. Now, the vision, published in 2000, has nothing to do with the assassination attempt in 1981, and there's no linkage of the vision either to the year 1960. So there must be some element of the secret that explains why the secret in its totality is related to the year 1960. And for that reason, I maintain, and it's the only logical conclusion, those who defend the official account, principally the Secretary of State, have been determined from the very beginning to destroy the connection between the year 1960 and the vision published in 2000 and the Third Secret. Because that linkage to the year 1960 points us in the direction of some missing text that would explain the relation between that year and the Third Secret. And so we asked Mr. De Carli, how do you explain the fact that while Cardinal Bertone claims that Sister Lucia confessed to him that there was never any link between the Third Secret in 1960, he himself appeared on Porta a Porta and displayed 2 sealed envelopes on the outside of which Sister Lucia had written, by the express order of the Blessed Virgin, this envelope may only be opened in 1960. How do you explain that, we asked Mr. De Carli. Who's telling us the truth here? And he answered as follows. This 1960 question is one that I have also posed to myself many times. because Sister Lucy wrote on the envelope that you must open it in 1960. But I think the answer by Cardinal Bertone is a convincing answer. Please note that we are dealing with a sister who could neither read nor write. She began to read and write when she was about 30 to 35 years old. Think about that. According to him, in defense of Cardinal Bertone's supposedly plausible explanation, Sister Lucia did not know how to read or write when she wrote on the outside of 2 envelopes that there is an express order of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that this secret, the contents of this envelope, and there are 2 envelopes, may not be opened before 1960. Then he went on to say, in my opinion, it is plausible that when she wrote 1960, I do not know if it was under inspiration or not, she might have thought of this date as a remote date, far in time from her. And she must have thought, I will certainly not be here in 1960, and therefore this secret can be revealed. This is aping Cardinal Bertone's explanation. Oh, she invented the date 1960 because she thought she'd be dead in 1960, and then we could all learn what the third secret was all about. Now, this was in 1944 that Lucia wrote down the third secret of Fatima, placed it in the sealed envelope, sent it off to the Bishop of Fatima. Why would Sister Lucia think she'd be dead only 16 years later? When she lived to be, how old was it, 97? Why would she pick 1960 as a date when she would surely be gone? Why such an odd number? Why not 20 years or 25 years? That explanation is absolutely nonsensical. Under no circumstances would Sister Lucia have simply invented a date when the Virgin herself said, you may not reveal this secret to anyone. You may, of course, tell Francisco. But when the time is right, I will give you the authority to reveal the third secret of Fatima. Sister Lucia did not invent the year 1960 as the date for the revelation of the secret. The Virgin expressly ordered that linkage. And that's why it appears on the 2 envelopes that, by the way, Cardinal Bertone never described for 7 years between 2000 and 2007 as bearing on their outsides an express order of the Virgin, which he wanted us to believe had never been given. Another issue that came up, the famous etc. We know that in the 4th memoir, the integral text of the third secret of Fatima ends with a reference to the state of the faith in Portugal and clearly in the rest of the world. In Portugal, the text of the secret continues. The dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc., followed by 3 ellipses, according to the Vatican, but in the actual memoir, it's just an etc., to indicate that Our Lady went on to speak about the question of dogma, and clearly Fatima scholars concluded this part of the integral text of the secret goes on to speak of a doctrinal or dogmatic crisis throughout the Church. Our Lady had more to say, much more to say. That was the whole purpose of the 4th memoir, to give us the gateway to the third secret. And Mr. De Carli was asked about whether he had ever interrogated Cardinal Bertone about this simple matter. What is contained within the etc.? And Mr. De Carli said last year, right here in this room, on the other side of it, to be exact, I do not remember this. When I'm not sure, I do not answer. With regards to the etc., following the phrase, Portugal will not lose the Catholic faith, etc., I said to Bertone, look, many have imagined that behind that etc. is another text which doesn't exist. And he answered, well, I don't recall any longer what he answered to me. I'm sorry, on this point I do not have a precise recollection. Now that's the very heart of this entire controversy. What is in the etc.? He says, I asked Bertone about it. It just slipped my mind what Cardinal Bertone said. And funny, isn't it, that Cardinal Bertone has never answered that question in any forum at any time whatsoever. He avoids that question, come le peste, like the plague, as the Italians say. And for that reason, the Vatican, when it published the vision that they claim is the entirety of the third secret, avoided, like the plague, the 4th memoir. and used the third memoir, which doesn't contain the reference to Portugal. We also asked Mr. De Carli last year about this famous issue of whether the third secret that Lucia authenticated is contained on fogli, meaning more than one sheet of paper, or simply un foglio, a single sheet of paper. We know that in Last Visionary of Fatima, Cardinal Bertone recounts that in April of 2000 he had a meeting with Sister Lucia, during which she said, and I'm quoting, "These are my sheets of paper, fogli. They are the sheets," she says a second time, fogli, that I used. We asked Mr. De Carli about that. How do you explain this? The vision is contained on a single sheet of paper, folded in half to make 4 sides for writing, but one sheet. And yet Lucia authenticated multiple sheets of paper. What do you say about that? And he said, oh, well, we fixed that. Because in the next edition of Last Visionary of Fatima, Last Secret of Fatima, and I'm quoting, "It is no longer multiple sheets, but a single sheet." Oh, well, that's a simple matter then. She said sheets, well, we'll change it to sheet. But the problem is they were quoting Sister Lucia directly, and so they altered her words to change sheets to sheet. But as I pointed out last year, in the introduction to Last Visionary of Fatima, which is now Last Secret of Fatima, there's a letter of introduction from Pope Benedict himself. And in that letter of introduction, which they cannot alter because it comes from the Pope, he says that he had contemplated very carefully what is contained in the fogli, the sheets, plural, pertaining to the third secret of Fatima. So that enormous discrepancy remains. But what Mr. De Carli showed us is that whenever necessary, what Sister Lucia says will be strategically altered just a bit. And we know from the Last Visionary of Fatima that although Sister Lucia authenticated sheets and also authenticated only one envelope, if you read Bertone's account in Last Visionary of Fatima, in 2000, we were shown one sheet of paper and multiple envelopes. And we know that Bishop Venancio, way back in the 1940s, when he held up the secret that was going to the Vatican, he saw one outer envelope and one inner envelope. 2 envelopes. And yet Cardinal Bertone has shown us a total of 4 envelopes. 2 outer envelopes and 2 inner envelopes right on camera. Never mentioned before, this assemblage of 4 envelopes. Now, when I see 2 outer envelopes and 2 inner envelopes, I have to conclude, as basically the whole world who's knowledgeable of this has concluded, that that indicates 2 texts of the secret, an outer envelope and an inner envelope for each text. The idea that there were 4 envelopes and 2 sealed envelopes with 1960 warnings on them for one text is ridiculous. Now, to the theme of vindication. A year ago, we had this conference, and a week after that conference, very significantly, the Pope himself reopened the entire case. He went on pilgrimage to Fatima. And on May 11th, 2010, he's on the airplane going to Portugal. And on the airplane, he had pre-selected questions posed to him. Pre-selected, meaning questions he wanted to be put to him because he wanted to answer the questions. And one of the questions put to him by the papal spokesman, Monsignor Lombardi, is this: Holiness, what significance do the apparitions of Fatima have for us today? And when you presented the text of the third secret in the Vatican press office in June 2000, it was asked of you whether the message could be extended beyond the attack on John Paul II, also to the other sufferings of the Pope. Is it possible, according to you, to frame also in that vision the sufferings of the Church of today for the sins of the sexual abuse of minors? Now, before we get to the Pope's answer, which is explosive, ask yourselves, why on earth would the Pope have put to him a question about the third secret of Fatima, when according to the official party line, that's over and done with? That culminated in 1981. It's consigned to the past, to use Cardinal Bertone's words. It's closed up, filed away, let's move on. And here's the Pope deliberately having put to him another question about the third secret of Fatima. And here's what he says in answer to the question from Lombardi. Beyond this great vision of the suffering of the Pope, which we can in substance refer to John Paul II, are indicated future realities of the Church, which are little by little developing and revealing themselves. Thus it is true that, listen carefully to this phrase, beyond the moment indicated in the vision, it is spoken, it is seen, the necessity of a passion of the Church that naturally is reflected in the person of the Pope, but the Pope is in the Church. And therefore, the sufferings of the Church are what is announced. He went on to say, as for the novelty that we can discover today in this message, it is that attacks on the Pope and the Church do not come only from outside, but the sufferings of the Church come precisely from within the Church, from sins that exist in the Church. This has always been known, but today we see it in a really terrifying way. That the greatest persecution of the Church, the greatest, he said, does not come from enemies outside, but arises from sin in the Church. Ponder that answer carefully. Think about the vision that was published in 2000. There is absolutely no correspondence between the information the Pope provides here and the vision standing alone. In the vision, what do we see? We see a Pope on a hill outside a half-ruined city, filled with bodies. We see the Pope being executed on that hill by a band of soldiers, not internal enemies of the Church. They execute him outside this devastated city. And then after that, they execute, same group of soldiers, bishops, priests, religious and members of the laity, one after the other, in the same manner, in the same place. What does it have to do with internal enemies of the Church? That's an attack by external enemies. Why would the Pope open up this subject and indicate future realities of the Church involving internal enemies of the Church, nothing of which is seen in the vision standing alone? And why, at Fatima, the very next day, would he say, I'll quote the Italian and give you the English translation, si illuderebbe chi pensasse che la missione profetica di Fatima sia conclusa. He deceives himself who thinks that the prophetic message of Fatima is concluded. Putting all of us together, we have a devastating frontal attack on the entire official version. The Pope simply destroyed the party line during his pilgrimage to Fatima. And Antonio Socci rightly and quite immediately declared such in public. He said the Pope has reopened the dossier on the third secret of Fatima. Paolo Rodari, who will be speaking here at this conference, asked the question, is Socci right? He wonders whether Socci is right. I'm not saying he's a partisan of our position, but he raises the question. And Antonio Socci says that with his remarks during the pilgrimage to Fatima, the Pope has begun, his words, an Operation Truth concerning the third secret of Fatima. Which is why I said at the beginning of my talk that we're not speaking in an echo chamber. The Pope himself clearly has heard us. What other explanation could there be when, after the third secret is supposedly dead and buried, within a week of our conference last year, the Pope reopens the whole subject on his flight to Fatima and at the Fatima shrine itself. And as Socci says, the Pope, and I'm quoting, reopened the Fatima file in such a precise and obvious way that everyone who, in these past years, rushed to give his praise to the curial version, meaning the Secretary of State, is now caught in a panic when confronted with the Pope's words. And as I note in this book, even Vittorio Messori said, and I quote, now the vast party of the Fatimites, vast he calls it. We're not such a tiny little minority anymore. We've become vast. There will be excitement to demonstrate that Pope Benedict XVI has betrayed himself. But as Socci wrote, in a conclusion that he aimed directly at the official account and Cardinal Bertone, the Pope, he wrote, wants us to understand that we must never be afraid of the truth, even when it is embarrassing or painful, because we do not serve God with lies. When we lie with the pretense that we are doing it for God, we are actually doing it for ourselves. God does not need our lies to defend and build his church. It is better to do a mea culpa, because God is stronger and bigger than any of our sins. Obviously, he concluded, this behavior is not understood in the Curia, meaning within the office of the Secretary of State. Not even, he added, by the Ratzinger fans. And what does he mean by that? He means that there are fans of Cardinal Ratzinger, people who think that they are defenders of loyalty to the papacy and to authority in the church, who want to perpetuate the official version, even though the Pope himself has essentially destroyed it. These are the false friends of Fatima that I referred to in my address yesterday. But even the mass media are waking up as a result of this conference, directly as a result of the conference we had last year. On June 23, 2010, on Rete 4, a major private TV station, on the show entitled Top Secret, there was a symposium of journalists, and they met under the title Fatima, an Unfinished Business. That was the title of one of the talks at our conference last year. They appropriated that title for a show in which they agree now, these major figures of the Italian media, that Fatima is indeed an unfinished business. And the journalist Bracchino said during this telecast, quote, even among Catholics all over the world, there is suspicion about the official revelation. This is the equivalent of somebody saying this on NBC. We're not talking, he said, about the secular world or protesters who want to challenge or dispute the church's policy. We're talking about the so-called Fatimites and other parts of the world's clergy who do not believe the official version. So this has clearly moved beyond Fatimist circles, beyond traditionalist circles. They can no longer claim it's the province of fanatics and conspiracy theories. It's now the talk of the media. And Andrea Tornielli, during the same broadcast, made this observation concerning the testimony of Archbishop Capovilla. But we must remember one fact, he said. Capovilla has repeatedly said that a text of the secret, an attachment, has always been kept inside the desk of the Pope, and has stated that it was he who revealed to Pope Paul VI, just a few days after his election, the place where the secret is located. He ended up by saying the existence of two texts in two different places seems to me now a well-established fact. When a journalist of that stature admits that the existence of two texts pertaining to the secret, and I'm not saying he agrees with us on the contents of the other text, he will address this conference as well. When a journalist of that stature makes that admission, we know that we're not in any kind of echo chamber, that our position has been heard loud and clear, thanks to the persistence of Father Gruner over all these years, and with devastating impact on the official version. We have seen nothing less than the end of the official version. It is now totally discredited, and nobody, no thinking person who examines the evidence carefully, is left with anything less than a reasonable doubt, or more likely, a moral certainty that something has been kept from us. But, to get into the final phase of my talk, the false friends of Fatima are still at work. I referred to them yesterday. I'll return to that theme today. Where the Pope has begun an Operation Truth, they continue the operation to bury the truth. I told you about Last Visionary of Fatima and Last Secret of Fatima, but there's a new book published on the theme of perpetuating the party line called Fatima for Today by Father Andrew Apostoli, a kind of a celebrity figure on the Eternal Word television network. And this book features a preface by Cardinal Burke, prefect of the Apostolic Signatura. Now, What competence does the Apostolic Signatura have in the Message of Fatima? None. It's the Church's highest canonical tribunal. It has no jurisdiction over Marian apparitions. But Cardinal Burke has been included in this book to give the appearance of authority to something that has no actual weight of authority behind it. And like Last Visionary and Last Secret, the book is filled with pious tributes, as I mentioned yesterday. Pious tributes to the Visionary, to the Message of Fatima, to its call for prayer and penance. But always in books of this kind, we find buried in the middle, buried toward the end, little bombs that are dropped to try to convince people that, well, yes, Fatima is wonderful in terms of prayer and penance, but let's no longer think about the third secret of Fatima. The consecration of Russia was accomplished. Fatima is essentially finished. And so this book, like the others along the same line, parrots the party line on Fatima. The third secret was revealed in the form of a vision. Russia was consecrated without any mention of Russia. The third secret has been revealed, the consecration has been done, so essentially we should all go home and pray and do penance. Now, of course we should pray and do penance, but there's a bit more to the Message of Fatima than prayer and penance by individual Catholics. Yet we're told that, based upon the authority of the Secretary of State, the party line, Fatima is finished. And the question I ask is, by what right does the Vatican Secretary of State, who has no pastoral authority over the universal church, issue dictates concerning the Message of Fatima? And the answer is obviously by no authority whatsoever. Back in 2000, the former Cardinal Ratzinger said the following about Bertone's interpretation, which is also Sodano's interpretation. And I quote, "It is not the intention of the church to impose a single interpretation." End quote. We have never been bound by the official version in the first place. And one might ask, well, how did the Vatican Secretary of State become involved in this process? We can only point to the reform of the Roman Curia after the Second Vatican Council, as a result of which the Vatican Secretary of State became a kind of prime minister of the church. And in the role of prime minister, the Vatican Secretary of State has adopted a kind of damage control policy, which is designed to serve the aims of dialogue, ecumenism, and relations with worldly powers. And I pointed out long ago that the day after they tried to bury Fatima in 2000, they had a little affair at the Vatican the day after, and the guest of honor was Mikhail Gorbachev. And who was seated next to him? Cardinal Sodano. Business as usual at the Vatican. But this is not the first time that the Secretary of State has been involved in an operation designed to cover up an important truth. We now know, in the wake of the scandal involving Father Maciel, that Cardinal Bertone was a key figure in the cover-up of the Maciel scandal. As America Magazine observed, and I'm quoting, "The key Vatican figure in protecting Maciel in the 1980s and 1990s was Cardinal Angelo Sodano, the all-powerful Secretary of State under John Paul II, and now Dean of the College of Cardinals." And as the National Catholic Reporter reported in a series of articles, and I'm stating the conclusion, Maciel developed a close relationship with Angelo Sodano, who served as Pope John Paul II's Secretary of State. The Legionaries of Christ, of which Maciel was head, hired Sodano's nephew as a consultant when they built their flagship institution, Regina Apostolorum University in Rome. Much later, efforts to reveal Maciel's machinations and sexual improprieties were actively blocked by pressure from Maciel's chief supporter, Cardinal Angelo Sodano. Now, by late 2004, the future Pope Benedict XVI had had quite enough of this campaign by Sodano. He broke with Sodano, to quote National Catholic Register, broke with Sodano, and ordered a lawyer on his staff, a canon lawyer, to commence an investigation. And 2 years later, he told Father Maciel to leave his ministry and go off to a monastery and spend the rest of his life in prayer and penance, and that's where Maciel died. And now on the question of Fatima, Pope Benedict has broken with Cardinal Sodano and Cardinal Bertone and the Secretary of State again. Yet we find Father Apostoli promoting the party line in this book. Why? Why does he continue to do this? When the Pope has demolished the party line, as Sochi recognizes, when Italian journalists are now speaking openly of widespread doubt of the official account, when Cardinal Ratzinger told us 11 years ago we were never bound by Cardinal Bertone's interpretation in the first place. Why would Father Apostoli, with the assistance of a high-ranking Vatican cardinal, go on promoting this party line? Why? Clearly, this is further damage control orchestrated from within the Vatican apparatus. And in his preface to Father Apostoli's book, Fatima for Today, the cardinal says, and I'm quoting, that there's nothing new in the third secret of Fatima, because, as he says, the first two parts of the secret contain nothing new, end quote, because hell is not a novel doctrine, and the vision of hell contains, quote, no novel or startling information. Excuse me, but there's a bit more to the first two parts of the secret than the vision of hell. There's a lot of new information. The imminent end of World War I, the commencement of World War II after the appearance of a strange light in the night sky, the breaking out of World War II during the reign of Pius XI, the spread of Russia's errors throughout the world, the martyrdom of the faithful, the suffering of the Pope, persecutions of the church because of communism, and the express connection of these future events to an ultimatum that all of these events will take place, and finally, the annihilation of various nations will take place, unless Our Lady of Fatima's specific requests are granted, including the consecration of Russia. Nothing new in the first two parts of the secret? There's everything new. And yet the purpose of this preface is to tell us that there's nothing new in any part of the message of Fatima that we need concern ourselves with. Now, the cardinal in the preface to Fatima for Today also says that Pope Benedict, I'm quoting, concludes that the secret is in the end the exhortation to prayer and likewise the summons to penance and conversion. Quoting not the Pope, however, but Cardinal Ratzinger 11 years ago. Not quoting the Pope today, who says that the message of Fatima relates to future realities of the Church, which we see in the third secret, which are revealing themselves in a truly terrifying way, and that he deceives himself who thinks that the prophetic message of Fatima is concluded. Why does this preface not mention what the Pope is saying today? Why does this preface talk about what Cardinal Ratzinger said 11 years ago? Why does this preface, mentioning what Cardinal Ratzinger said 11 years ago, say that this is what the Pope says, when what the Pope actually says is ignored? Now, this book promotes a demonstrable falsehood. I mentioned it yesterday. It says that, and I'm quoting, Sister Lucia had chosen the year 1960 as the time to reveal the third secret, end quote. No, she didn't. We know that's a falsehood. And so for the same reason the entire official account is destroyed by that falsehood. Sister Lucia did not lie about 1960. Someone else is lying. For that very reason, this book is not credible. But the book goes on defending the interpretation of Cardinal Sodano, which is now the interpretation of Cardinal Bertone. And the book says that in the first two parts of the July apparition, meaning the first two parts of the secret, Our Lady spoke. But in the third part, she did not speak at all. Does that make sense? Something as obvious as the vision of hell, she explained to them by saying, you have seen hell, where the souls of poor sinners go. We're supposed to believe that an ambiguous vision of the bishop dressed in white being executed on a hill outside a city filled with cadavers is something about which Our Lady had nothing to say. Even more incredibly, we're expected to believe that the meaning of this vision has been reserved for well nigh 100 years, or the better part of 100 years, to the interpretation of the Vatican Secretary of State. The Vatican Secretary of State is the oracle of Our Lady of Fatima, and without him, we don't know what the vision means. Does anyone believe that for even a moment? You know, there are many indications of something missing. But this, to me, if you look at nothing else, may be more probative than any other indication, just as a matter of common sense. How could it be that we are left in a situation of an obscure vision involving an apocalyptic scene of a destroyed city filled with bodies, a pope being executed, can only be interpreted for us by the Vatican Secretary of State, the same prelate involved in covering up a massive sexual scandal? This is preposterous. And yet, Father Apostoli, with this book, persists in promoting the fiction that we are to be guided by the opinions of the Vatican Secretary of State on the meaning of Fatima. And here, he too joins with the official party line in saying that there's nothing amiss about the failure to use the fourth memoir, which contains the reference to Portugal. Nothing suspicious there. But the Vatican itself admitted that the fourth memoir, which contains the reference to Portugal, was written by Sister Lucia for the sake of completeness. The Vatican's own publication in 2000 says that Sister Lucia revealed that she had written the fourth memoir so that, as she wrote, I shall say everything. I shall not knowingly omit anything, though I suppose I may forget just a few small details of minor importance. She also said that she would write down everything that she was then permitted to reveal. So clearly the fourth memoir is the document the Vatican should have relied upon. And I pose these questions to Father Apostoli publicly regarding the fourth memoir with the reference to the etc. If there's nothing to hide, why did the Vatican commentary avoid the fourth memoir, which it admits is the more complete record? There is nothing to hide. Why does the Vatican's publication back in 2000 call the fourth memoir just some annotations by Sister Lucia? If there's nothing to hide, why have Cardinals Sodano and Bertone refused to answer any questions concerning the etc.? You remember I said a few moments ago, Mr. De Carli said he asked Cardinal Bertone about the etc. He just doesn't remember what the Cardinal told him. It slipped his mind. If there's nothing to hide, why do both Cardinal Sodano and Bertone fail and refuse to ask Sister Lucia a single question about the message contained within that etc.? When everyone knows that's the very heart of the controversy. They had unlimited access to the seer. They could have asked her about it at any time, and they failed and refused to do so. Now, Father Apostoli in this book, Perpetuating the Party Line, says, and I quote, Cardinal Sodano said that the children saw a prophetic vision which must be understood as symbolic. Cardinal Sodano said, with all due respect, who cares what Cardinal Sodano said? Cardinal Ratzinger told us in 2000 we need not follow his interpretation. The Pope himself has recently rejected that interpretation. Father Apostoli knows the Pope has rejected that interpretation, yet he's still telling us that we must follow what Cardinal Sodano said. What in heaven's name is going on here? Why are they insisting that the Vatican Secretary of State is the oracle of Our Lady of Fatima? Now, concerning the bishop in white who was executed by a band of soldiers, Father Apostoli continues the party line. Here's his explanation. We see that the Pope in the vision is killed. John Paul II was not killed. He survived. Ergo, he cannot be the Pope in the vision. But according to Father Apostoli, and I'm quoting, it was as if he had died and then been snatched back from the jaws of death. He lost 6 pints of blood. But he recovered. He lived for another 25 years. He returned to the ski slopes. He was skiing after the assassination attempt. But I suppose this is close enough for government work, meaning the government of the Vatican City-State, as exercised by Cardinal Sodano and his successor, Cardinal Bertone. But to be serious, we know that Cardinal Sodano falsified the vision from the very beginning back in 2000 when he said that in the vision, the Pope apparently falls dead. Not apparently, he is dead. He's killed. To quote the vision, was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him. And the vision goes on to say that after the Pope is killed, others in the church are killed in the same manner. I'm quoting the vision. And in the same way there died one after another bishops, priests, men, women, religious, and various lay people of different ranks and positions. They all die in the same way, on the top of that hill, outside that devastated city, filled with bodies from which the Pope has barely escaped alive. But we're told by Cardinal Sodano and Father Apostoli in this book that that's just a reference to a possible nuclear war, which we can avert if we just do a lot of prayer and penance. No need for us to know what's in the third secret. No need for us to take any evasive action in the church. No need for us to adhere to any warnings that might be contained in the secret. We are supposed to stake the fate of the church and the world on what Cardinal Sodano says. Why? Who gave him this authority? No one. He arrogated it to himself. Now it seems there's no absurdity too big for Father Apostoli to swallow. He addresses the objection that John Paul II could not have been the Pope of the third secret because he did not die. It's obvious. Here's his answer. He asserts the following. John Paul II, I quote, recognized himself as the Pope who was slain in the vision. A Pope who's alive recognizes himself as a Pope who was slain? Oh, well, John Paul II knew about that objection, says Father Apostoli. I'm quoting, which is the reason he said he came to the very threshold of death and should have died, but Our Lady prevented him from doing so. Where did the Pope say this? This is Father Apostoli telling us what the Pope said. We have never received any official declaration from the Pope that he considers himself the vision, the Pope depicted in the vision. Other people are saying that. And then Father Apostoli goes on to say, this is his interpretation. He adds to the party line. Just as the Holy Father was killed in the vision, so were all those who followed after him. There were men and women who died as martyrs because of their love for the church. We have already seen the tremendous number of martyrs in Russia. There were countless others who sacrificed their lives as well. Listen to what he's saying here. He's saying that the martyrs of the 20th century who died before John Paul II, who did not die, died after John Paul II, who did not die. So this symbolic key that Cardinal Sodano says we have to use to interpret the third secret is a very rubbery device, isn't it? You can bend it any way you want, as long as you arrive at the official interpretation. Fatima belongs to the past. It all ended in 1981 when the Pope who was not killed was killed. It's literally killed, symbolically killed, whatever. As long as we arrive at the conclusion that there is nothing further to fear in the prophetic content of Fatima. Now, what about the Pope's revelations? Father Apostoli considers these. I'll try to race to a conclusion here by pointing you to one slide that I prepared on this. If you could put it up, I'll indicate what we're talking about. You'll see two versions of the same statement. Top version is the Vatican's translation of what the Pope said on the airplane going to Portugal. Look at the bold and italics. He begins his statement, as for the new things which we can find in this message today, there was also the fact that attacks on the Pope and the Church come not only from without, but the sufferings of the Church come precisely from within the Church, from the sin existing within the Church. That's what the Pope said. That's the Vatican's official translation of his remarks on the plane. Look at the bottom version. That's the version that appears in Father Apostoli's book, Fatima for Today. Notice that the phrase in bold and italics in the top has been cut out. And now the phrase begins with attacks. Attacks on the Pope and the Church do not come only from the outside. Fatima for Today eliminates the connection between attacks on the Pope with what the Pope said are new things that we can find in this message today. In that way, Fatima for Today eliminates the Pope's explicit linkage of new things which we can find in this message, meaning the third secret, the vision, and attacks on the Church by internal enemies, which again are not mentioned in the vision. Which is why the Pope said on the airplane, beyond the moment indicated in the vision, it is spoken. How could there be anything beyond the moment indicated in the vision if the third secret is confined to the vision? Pope is clearly revealing something here. And Fatima for Today cuts the words from the Pope's statement that link new information in the third secret to the vision. Now, what's my conclusion? Clearly there's a text that makes sense of all of this. The Pope links the vision to sexual scandals in the church, to future realities of the church, to attacks by internal enemies within the church. None of that is in the vision, none of it. And yet he says the third secret contains references to these things. The only conclusion is there must be a text that ties it all together. There must be a soundtrack to the movie that we see in the vision published in 2000. And that soundtrack would say something like this. There's a crisis in the church. Many fall into a state of sin. Vocations are lost. The faith and discipline of the church collapse. And this crisis in the church is accompanied by a crisis in the world. Maybe a number of natural disasters, like the one in Japan. Maybe 250 tornadoes in the United States in a few weeks alone. Maybe a flooding of the Mississippi without precedent in the history of America. Maybe wars, persecutions, disasters all over the world connected to this crisis in the church. And do we have another Fatima apparition that says that, which contains words linking a vision of future devastation together in one secret? Yes, we do. The message of Akita. And what do we have but Cardinal Ratzinger saying that the message of Akita, revealed in 1973, and the message of Fatima are one and the same, or essentially the same message, as he revealed to the ambassador to the Philippines, Mr. Howard D. What does Our Lady of Akita say? She says exactly what I'm talking about here. She links a crisis in the church to a global or planetary catastrophe. She says, and I quote, "As I told you, if men do not repent and better themselves, the Father will inflict a terrible punishment on all humanity. It will be a punishment greater than the deluge. Fire will fall from the sky and will wipe out a great part of humanity. The good as well as the bad, sparing neither priests nor faithful. The survivors will find themselves so desolate that they will envy the dead." And what do we see in the vision published in 2000? Fire emanating from the hands of the avenging angel. And according to Cardinal Sodano, well, that's repel, that's just a nuclear war. We needn't worry about that. Take it from me, the Secretary of State, and my successor, who spent 20 years covering up a sexual scandal. He is the oracle of Our Lady of Fatima. Believe him. Ignore the linkage that Cardinal Ratzinger himself, now the Pope, makes between a crisis internally in the church and a disaster for the world. And Our Lady of Akita went on to say, the work of the devil will infiltrate even the church in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops against other bishops. The priests who venerate me will be scorned and opposed by their confreres. Churches and altars sacked. The church will be full of those who accept compromise. And the demon will press many priests and consecrated souls to leave the service of the Lord. The demon will be especially implacable against souls consecrated to God. Does that sound familiar to any of us sitting here today? Does not that describe the state of the church, which Cardinal Ratzinger, just before he became Pope, described in a single word? Filth. Now, given the still unfolding geological and nuclear catastrophe in Japan, centered on the very diocese, the Diocese of Sendai, where Our Lady of Akita gave us the prophecy I just read, we should be concerned about this linkage of the two secrets, which the party line promoters are trying to tell us have nothing to do with each other. And finally, and the crowning insult to all of us, Fatima for today simply ignores the Pope's statement at the Fatima Shrine that one deceives himself who thinks that the prophetic mission of Fatima is concluded. And there can be only one reason. Fatima for Today and all these other books have been written to promote the very self-deception the Pope condemned at Fatima, and to make it our self-deception if we allow it to happen. But of course, we're not allowing it to happen. That's why we're here. So to conclude, we have been vindicated. The proponents of the Fatima party line have given us a Fatima not for today, but for yesterday. The Fatima that the Vatican Secretary of State would give us. But the truth has come out. Pope has said, he who says that the prophetic mission of Fatima is concluded, is engaging in self-deception. But that deception has not claimed us, and more people have awoken from that self-deception. And the reason Fatima for today ignores the Pope's words in this respect is that it was written in a last gasp of the effort to continue that self-deception. Yesterday I said, this farce must come to an end. So much more colorful in Italian. Questa farsa deve finire. And it will come to an end if we persevere in our commitment to the truth, just as Father Gruner has done. And it's because of his work that we are in this position today, where now the whole world is knowledgeable about this controversy, is waking up to the truth. The truth that the false friends of Fatima have tried to bury. But they cannot bury it, because it comes from heaven, and thus it will always triumph over the plans of mere men, just as the Immaculate Heart will triumph in the end. Thank you.
I have come to warn the faithful to amend their lives and ask pardon for their sins. They must not continue to offend our Lord, who is already deeply offended. In the final vision on October 13, 1917, Our Lady silently held out the scapular, a gesture which indicates that she wants everyone to wear it. Our Lady said, "If my requests are not heeded, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world, raising up wars and persecutions against the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer, and various nations will be annihilated." Pray a great deal and make sacrifices for sinners, for many souls go to hell because they have no one to make sacrifices and pray for them.
The Blessed Virgin gave us a message how to have world peace, that only she can help us. But perhaps we don't get enough perspective. We say, well, nothing dramatic has happened. And it's because our commentators, our newspapers, our editor writers, the people that we really pay attention to, the people that speak on television, in the mainstream press and so forth, people who are under the pay of the enemy often, have yet to point out to us that since we have despised Our Lady's message as the human family, we've despised it, there have been 1,686,570,000 violent deaths as a direct result of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima. That is, again, 1 billion. That is 1 with 9 zeros after it, plus another 686 million people who have died violently for the one simple reason that we've ignored Our Lady of Fatima. We could point out, perhaps another time, that if this is not enough perspective to give us that in these 95 years of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima, we have paid a tremendous price. But as bad as that is, that price will be doubled or tripled in the next couple of years if we ignore her much longer. Just a few months ago, the world's population passed 7 billion people. 7 billion people. Scripture tells us, and other prophecies tell us, that 1/3 to 2/3 of the entire population of mankind will be wiped out in this war to come. I don't know what it takes to wake us up. Maybe we have to find it on NBC or CBS or some commentator in the New York Times before we finally take this seriously. And maybe we say to ourselves, we take it seriously, but I think we don't take it seriously enough. We have many priorities. Sometimes I wonder how I get through my day between what I'm supposed to do today, between getting up and doing my reading, doing my other work, talking to people that God wants me to talk to and so forth. And we only all have 24 hours a day. And I'm sure that my life is not as busy as the bishops and the Pope. But we must make this priority number one. There is nothing more serious, nothing more important, nothing more urgent than Our Lady's message at Fatima. And this is something that I don't know how to say. I remember getting a letter from an older bishop many years ago. I think he was in Ottawa. And he said to me basically in his letter, Father Gruner, if you would not raise your voice so much, if you would not yell at us, we might start paying attention to you. And I wrote back to him and I said, I appreciate very much your interest and your concern and your advice. Now, if you can tell me how I can do that any better than what I'm doing and get the attention, I'd be very happy to do it. I hate yelling at people. I hate raising my voice, and I hate trying to draw attention to myself. But there's no other way around on this message. If there's something more important, and certainly yesterday we were in this March for Life here in Rome, and the number of people that are killed by abortion since about 1975, by the statistics, we looked up, is about 1,300,000 people. And by war, there's another 78 million people. And then by government murder, not only in Russia and China, but other parts of the world, 238 million people. These are catastrophic, and they lead us to think that we are, as Pope Pius XII, rather Pius X, St. Pius X said, that we are in the days just before the coming of the Antichrist. These things that are happening to us, which Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, said, that refer to this Fatima message is found in sacred scripture, that we are living the times of the apocalypse. And although we can be distracted with everything from daily newspapers to new movies or whatever else it is that entertains us, these things are happening around us, and they're happening every day. And they're happening in such a way that how can we deny that we're living in, if it's not the apocalypse, if it is not the time coming before the Antichrist, it is the best, shall we say, preview or event which the world has never seen before. Just looking at the Catholic Church, for example, the only other time in church history that comes close to this time is the Arian crisis, when 90% of the bishops were Arian. And there was only about 3 or 4 bishops who actually stood up, and the greatest of them all, St. Athanasius, was actually excommunicated by the Pope in 357 AD. Now, he wasn't really excommunicated because, as the Church has always recognized, as St. Thomas points out, that law is not something that just the legislator says. Law is the ordination of reason. It is for the common good. And as the Church law to this day points out, that no one can be punished if he doesn't commit a crime. So because Athanasius was standing up for the faith, because he was defending the faith, which was his duty to do, he could not be punished even if the Pope pronounced a sentence of excommunication. In fact, Liberius regretted his action, but Liberius is the first Pope not to be canonized from the time of St. Peter to the year 357. It's well for us to remember then that we need not be afraid of the judgments of men if we are on the right side of God. It's a principle that we need to keep in mind. We also have to understand that prophecy is a function in the Church. It's a function that will never go away. It's a function that must be respected, just as the apostolic offices must be respected. As St. Paul tells us in Ephesians, the Church is built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, not just the apostles. The role of prophecy is essential. Scripture tells us that we must not extinguish the Spirit. We must not despise prophecy, but we must test all things and hold fast that which is good. So that is why I've promoted the message of Fatima, not only because it's unique among all the messages, but of course it's been approved by the Church. As Father Joseph St. Marie pointed out here in Rome, he's the one who wrote the speech for the Pope in 1982 when he went to Fatima. Father Joseph St. Marie points out that it is the role of the hierarchy to judge, to test whether the prophet speaks the truth. But once the hierarchy recognizes that the message comes from God, then the Pope himself and the bishops are bound to obey, not the prophet, but God who speaks through the prophet to them. That obligation is primordial. That is not for us to say, I'm telling the Pope what to do. No, but Our Lady of Fatima is telling him what to do. All I do is explain what it means. I answer the objections of theologians or others who haven't had the time to think about it. So when we get back to 1917, Our Lady comes. She comes and gives a message to show mankind the way to peace. She was asked, she was insisted that she come. She comes and she explains. And then for the next 95 years, we basically ignore her. So Our Lord himself, in 1931, explained to the Pope and the bishops something, a lesson from history. He said, "Make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like the King of France, they will follow him into misfortune." What is that example he's talking about, the King of France? On the 17th of June, to the very day, the 17th of June, 1689, our Lord spoke to St. Margaret Mary and told her to tell the King of France to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Now the kings of France, there were 3 of them from that day, all ignored St. Margaret Mary's prophecy and our Lord's command through St. Margaret Mary. Even during her lifetime, St. Margaret Mary was known as a saint. She was well hidden, but her reputation for sanctity was well known among her contemporaries. And so, for them to ignore this, they paid with their lives. On the 17th of June, 1789, that's 100 years later to the day, the King of France was stripped of his authority by the Third Estate. 3 weeks later, the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. On the 20th or 21st of January, 1994, his head was cut off by the soldiers of the Revolution. And our Lord makes reference to this and says, "Make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like him, they will follow him into misfortune." Up until now, basically, the popes and the bishops around him have ignored, have delayed, have had one excuse after another. I think I've heard them all. And as we've had proven at these conferences before, none of those excuses really hold water. There is really no excuse for not doing it. However, that is not their choice up to now. And so we have a choice here. Of course, none of us are the Pope. None of us can command the Pope. Only he has the authority to command in the church himself or others, all the rest of the church. But we are not without resources. We will talk about this in another conference. But it's not just for the Pope. As the Pope himself, speaking at Fatima 2 years ago, said, what is foretold in the secret is the passion of the church. And yes, there's a persecution of the Pope, but the Pope is within the church. And so it's not just the Pope that suffers the passion coming up, but it is the church also.
I have come to warn the faithful to amend their lives and ask pardon for their sins. They must not continue to offend our Lord, who is already deeply offended.